What I want to do is give you some insights into what works to close gender gaps, in particular focusing on gender gaps in economic opportunity. In fact, I want to start by introducing you to this woman here. Her name is Heidi Roizen, and she is a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. A few years back, a colleague of mine wrote a case study on Heidi, describing how Heidi invested, built enterprises, networked in Silicon Valley. However, we don't always teach the case with the protagonist being called Heidi, but sometimes we replace her name by Howard. The case is identical, but then we give half of our students the case with the protagonist being called Heidi, the other half of our students the case with the protagonist being called Howard. And then we do a survey at the end asking students how they think about this venture capitalist and whether or not they liked him or her, whether they would like to hire him or her. You know where this is going. People generally think that both Heidi and Howard are competent and do a good job, but they don't like Heidi. And they don't like Heidi because Heidi is not conforming to our gender norms of what a typical venture capitalist looks like. The good news is that, let me start with the bad news. The bad news is that we're all affected by unconscious bias. And the good news is that we're all affected by unconscious bias. It is bad news because it's hard to overcome. By definition, we're not aware of it. But it is good news because this is not about the bad people out there, not in this room, but it really is about all of us in this room. And so that's what we're trying to do in this talk here. Think about how we can make it easier for all of us to do the right thing. Let me show you an image here, and I'd love for you to compare squares A and B. And I presume that most of you see square B as being lighter than square A. Turns out that this is an illusion, and I presume that now most of you see them as being identical. Your mind is making sense of the pattern that you see. It's a checkerboard, and therefore a light square has to be next to a dark square. And you're also aware of the shadow. What I'm doing now by covering the surroundings here is quite literally liberating your minds to see square B for what it is, namely another dark square. I'm arguing that this is how you see the world. You put people into boxes, and when you think kindergarten teacher, you think women, and when you think engineer, you think men. And if people like Heidi are in the wrong box, we tend to punish people for violating our gender norms. So what do we do? Let me start with a design innovation, which quite literally also has been liberating people's minds to see, in this case here, musicians for the music that they play. Put differently, to be able to listen to the music rather than to look at the person playing the music. In the 70s, some of the major orchestras in the United States introduced curtains and had their musicians audition behind the curtain. This was introduced, interestingly enough, while orchestra directors went on record saying, clearly they of all people only cared about the quality of the music that is played and not whether somebody looks the part. It turns out that curtains increased the chances that women would advance to future rounds by 50%. And have played an important part in increasing the fraction of women from about 5% in the 70s to now almost 40% on the US major orchestras. So that is the power of design, and that it changes outcomes really without changing mindsets, at least a priori. I'm not saying that we could never change mindsets. A very interesting thought experiment that the orchestras aren't willing to engage in, which I understand, but is an interesting one, is that now that we see more female musicians, maybe we could do away with the curtains again. So behavioral design is building on the idea of curtains. It doesn't just involve blind auditions, although I am in fact a fan of blinding ourselves to demographic characteristics of job candidates more generally. But it goes beyond that, really trying to build on how our minds work, to inform our practices, procedures, and policies in organizations, including in schools and companies, but also in governments. This, of course, is quite different from the kinds of things that many organizations have been focusing on in the past 20 years or so. In the US, estimates run at about $8 billion a year in terms of money that companies spend on diversity training. I've tried really hard to find evidence on whether these 5 different types of things that we could be doing work or don't work. There's 2 big insights. The first one is we don't measure nearly enough. We tend to just throw money at the problem either because we want to check a box and say, yes, we have a diversity training program, therefore we're doing the right thing, or because we don't care enough, or because we don't take people management as seriously as, for example, financial decision making. That's the first insight. The second one is that sadly the news is not that great. For example, in terms of diversity training programs, I feel pretty confident to say at this point that I have not found a single study showing that it works, even though for many companies it's their favorite tool to engage diversity. It does get a bit better as we are looking at some of these other interventions. So for example, on mentoring and sponsorship, the evidence is a bit more encouraging that it can work. And it means that people really have to engage as mentors and sponsors, but really almost adopting a person and being available to that person with advice and support, and also picking up the phone and, for example, making calls on that person's behalf. But I want to move beyond these types of interventions, which either have focused on fixing our minds or on fixing women. I'm saying this a bit negatively, obviously, and I don't mean it quite as negative. When I teach a class at Harvard, for example, on negotiation, I can't, of course, tell our students to wait, let's say, 150 years until we have fixed the system. But I have to help them navigate the system as well. But I really want to focus on what organizations can do to level the playing field. I want to talk about 3 different broad buckets. So let me start with talent management here. Interestingly enough, talent management is a tough nut for us to crack because most everyone thinks that they are great at judging people and that they are really expert interviewers, for example. It turns out that unstructured interviews are likely the worst predictors of future performance that we could use. But there's much research suggesting that unstructured interviews are the place where bias kicks in, where I'm going to look for a shared hobby, for example, and you will tell me that you have also been a synchronized swimmer like me, and I will think, oh, that makes her a great professor at Harvard. In fact, when you ask interviewers, they will often report to you that they kind of look for someone who looks like them. And that's, of course, what we're up against. So unstructured interviews are really bad. But let me unpack this picture here a bit more for you to suggest to you that basically everything you see here is wrong. So, first mistake. The problem with panel interviews is that the 3 people you see up there will not come up with independent assessments of the job candidate. They will influence each other, and they will also more likely defer to the most senior person on the panel. So much better to do 3 separate interviews, which in fact for the interviewers is not more time consuming. Organizations will always say, oh, but God, we don't have the time. Whether they do it independently or jointly doesn't matter for their time management. It is more time consuming for the candidate, no question, but it also is the better and the fairer process. Second, this is more of a myth than a big mistake, but still important to acknowledge that diversity among the interviewers is not going to solve our diversity issues, because these biases are actually shared by all of us, basically independent of our own demographic characteristics. If we don't see male kindergarten teachers and we don't see female engineers, we don't naturally associate those jobs with men or women respectively, independent of who we are. Now, diversity on search committees is useful because we tend to have different networks and we might reach out to different types of candidates, but it doesn't protect us from bias. Thirdly, and of course I'm now reading a bit much into this one picture here, we should try really hard to force our minds to evaluate candidates comparatively. One basic insight of behavioral science is that anything that you perceive, anything that you judge, is relative to something else. Human beings are incapable of making absolute judgments. The coffee you might have had for breakfast or the tea you might have had for breakfast and whether or not you liked it has something to do with the kinds of coffees or the kinds of teas that you're used to. The same is true when we evaluate job candidates. We tend to compare them with something that's available to us, which is this little person sitting in our heads here, the reference person or the stereotype. In order to basically debunk this little person in our heads, what we've shown with our own research is that if you focus your mind on comparative evaluation, really comparing different candidates with each other, this will help you calibrate without having to go back to the stereotype. The best technique or the best tool that you can use to predict future performance are work sample tests. But whenever possible, try to mimic what the person is going to have to do once he or she has joined your organization. But given that we feel that we literally have to see a candidate face to face, the alternative to unstructured interviews are structured interviews. You predetermine the questions you want to ask. You ask the same questions for all your candidates in the same order. And ideally, you evaluate or rank answers to every question after the person has answered that question. And again, try to do this comparatively. Structured interviews have been shown to be much more likely to predict future performance, as are work sample tests. So maybe a combination of the two would be the way to go. Of course, there's much more in talent management than just hiring. For example, job advertisements and how we have to be vigilant about the language that we use, using inclusive language. So one example, for example, has been a school that was looking for more male teachers because all of our elementary schools only have about 15% male teachers. It's not a good strategy for them to look for a compassionate, caring teacher in a collaborative or supportive work environment because these adjectives are gendered and in our minds typically associated with women. We also have to worry about what happens once you have entered the door. How are you evaluated in terms of your performance? What is the promotion process in your organization? Because what we're up against, of course, is also this pyramid, which says that we have many, many more women entering the labor force at the entry level, but then very, very few women at the top. But let me move on and talk a bit about redesigning school and work. This is a multiple choice test. We've studied this test based on probably the most important test that American students ever have to take, the SAT. The SAT is hugely relevant in determining which college people can go to. We were concerned about the SAT, in particular the multiple choice part of the SAT, for the following reason. Much research suggests that women tend to be more risk averse than men. Now, a multiple choice test typically has kind of the following format, that you would get points for right answers. For the SAT it was you get 1 point for every right answer. You deducted a quarter point for wrong answers. Now, if you are risk averse, you will be less likely to guess or volunteer an answer and more likely to skip. If you're risk loving, you might just guess no matter what. And that was the worry that Katie Baldiga Kaufman, a former doctoral student of mine, had. And what she did was she brought people to the laboratory, had them take the SAT, and then in a second round, forced everyone to answer every question, which allowed her to measure what people would have known if they had not skipped. It turns out that for equally knowledgeable people, women do worse on the SAT just because they are more likely to skip questions and less likely to guess. We kind of lucked out in that the College Board, which designs these tests, elected a new chair in 2012 and was quite open to thinking about design. And starting this year, actually starting last month in March, the SAT, which has been running for about 100 years now, is going to be genderly biased. Katie studied a number of possible interventions that the College Board could have adopted. What they ended up adopting was they took away the penalty from wrong answers completely, which of course led to the criticism that they are inviting wild guessing. At which point the response has to be, we have been inviting guessing by 50% of the population for 100 years, and now we're ready to include everyone. Here's another thing that really matters, and that's actually quite low-hanging fruit. A few years back, 11 years in fact, we noticed that of all our portraits of leaders, exactly 0 were of female leaders. 50% of our students are women, and it certainly wasn't our conscious intention to signal to women that they were not made for leadership. This is a professor here, a colleague of mine, Jenny Mansbridge, on your right. It took Jenny to actually walk through our halls and say, oh my God. Since then, we have commissioned more portraits of leaders. This is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia. She's also a graduate of the school. And we quite literally have changed the face of Harvard. Have a look at your organizations. What are we signaling to our students and our employees in our organizations with the portraits or paintings on our walls? This is just a story, but there are a number of studies examining the impact of what we see around us, not just in real people. I mean, real people role models also matter, but also just in images, and it does matter. Now, here's the good news. The world is changing. Even Star Wars now has a female protagonist with Rey. But while I just brought your hopes up, here's the bad news. You might remember that Monopoly created a special edition based on this particular film, only to forget to include the female characters. Monopoly has since fixed this, but it just shows how deep this unconscious bias runs. Diversity is hard work. It is harder to work in a team full of people who disagree with our own conceived notions of what the right action is. But of course, that's exactly why we care about diversity, because we want to have different perspectives, and we want to have real debate going on in these teams, and we don't want everyone just to run into one direction, which we normally refer to in psychology as groupthink. But it is hard work, and when you interview people afterwards, people in diverse teams will time and again report that they didn't think their team performed well, and that it really wasn't that much fun, even though objectively their team performed better than the homogeneous teams. But they will report that because the experience was much tougher than in a very homogeneous team. But let me give you kind of 2 ideas of kind of where to start. The first one is critical mass really does matter. Diversity is not just a numbers game, but it is also a numbers game. If you are the only one, the only woman, the only man, the only Swiss in my case, you will be very likely to be turned into a token asked to represent a particular group that you're the only one of. So broadly speaking, critical mass is around 30% or 3 of a given group. But we have to do more than changing numbers. Of course, it also matters how we organize our teams, and in particular, how we collaborate, how we engage with one another. So shaping norms, the norms of engagement, has been shown to be really important in affecting both the productivity as well as how enjoyable it is to work in these teams. Let me illustrate this with 2 beaches. Where would you be more likely to drop a piece of paper? The same is true for teams. That we have to create norms that create a safe environment for everyone to speak up, to be heard, to be acknowledged, where people do not feel entitled to drop a dirty joke. That is the power of norms. But let me bring this back to this country, because in many ways the UK has been a leader on norm entrepreneurship, as you might want to call this. Most of you will be familiar with the Davis report, and of course a collaboration of many others, including the 30% Club, government, private sector, in increasing the fraction of women on corporate boards to now more than 25% in the UK's FTSE 100 companies. This was done not with quotas, but by relying on many of the insights that we're discussing today. So this is a brochure that we were shown in 2013 when we got a call from the office of the Secretary of Business at the time, Vince Cable. And that was the brochure that they used to talk about the kinds of things that organizations could do to increase diversity on their boards. What it shows you is the fraction of women on the FTSE 100 boards. At the time, there was 17% women. There's much evidence suggesting that sometimes descriptive norms can turn into prescriptive norms, not just describing how the world is, but telling us how the world should be. So I was nervous that this could actually signal to us that it's just how the world should be. And so we designed a different cover for them. And we're still focusing on the FTSE 100 companies, but we're now showing the companies which already at the time had diverse boards. At the time, these were 94%. I'm sure already intuitively looking at these two images, you can see that on the right-hand side, what we're communicating to you is that the thing to do is to be diverse. Otherwise, you're really an outlier. If you'd like to know more about some of the studies that I just described to you, visit our webpage, which is an open access online platform. We've tried to summarize many of the insights that I've provided to you today for people who are interested in closing gender gaps in education, in health, in political participation, or in economic opportunity. And with that, I wish you best of luck and lots of success redesigning your organizations.